Hello guys, my name is Temperance Brennan. I'm creating this series called Lore 101 for Final Fantasy XIV. It's my hope that story skippers, new players, and veterans will be able to understand the story within the game a little easier through a wide variety of topics, this video's topics particularly being the Void. Please be mindful that there are some spoilers in the story leading up until at least the Shadowbringers expansion and even maybe a little beyond that, so you have been warned. With that out of the way, please enjoy and let's get into it. So what exactly is the Void? By Eorzean lore, it is an otherworldly plane of existence that harbors creatures hell-bent on hurting anyone they come in contact with. Not only that, in times past, it was used as a medium, and still currently is, to shift the blame onto. Did a plague hit Eorzea? Is that tenant you just let in your Gridanian house glaring at the floor all the time with heavy breaths? Did you lose your house keys? All of it could be blamed on the Void. Throughout history, it was also attempted to be examined by the Allegan Empire, scholars of Thavnair, and even the more recent Sons of St. Koinok. What was determined was essentially the previous statement, but other than that, not much was successfully found to our knowledge, other than recordings of tales, folklore, and some hard facts from previous era's documentation. With the new patch having come out, as well as the new expansion, we know that the Void is going to be the focal point of the upcoming story. Because of this, it's important that we understand what the Void is, how it was created, and what inhabits it. Now, the Void itself, as we know now, is truly another plane. But why are the inhabitants so violent and colorfully abhorrent is still largely a mystery, as to how the Void actually came to be. In that world, a literal flood of darkness destroyed all, including the ethereal balance of all life. If the world was anything like our own, we can assume it had lush landscapes, civilizations, and plenty of flora and fauna. Nowadays, nothing can maintain a constant state of equilibrium, having been turned towards the umbral dark element nearly in its entirety. This makes anything susceptible to etheric corruption, if they were to go into the Void, as well as being horribly twisted and mad with hunger for said ether. However, what is notable is the influence it currently has on the world and the story that we are experiencing. Regarding this information, however, we do need to first understand what exactly the Void is, and that's what we're going to hop into first. In the Shadowbringers expansion, we are told how the world once was before the Void's inception. Originally, there was only one world, and it was split into 13 other reflections of itself, with the 14th where our player resides being called the Source. This followed a battle between two major entities named Hydaelyn and Zodiark. Their conflict resulted in Hydaelyn not only creating the other worlds, but also having each one carry a piece of Zodiark's soul and sealing it away. Following this, one of the main enemy groups of the game, the Ascians, sought to rejoin these fragments of Zodiark by breaking down the barriers between each world so that when he rejoined all 14, he would be able to come back and resurrect their dead brethren. That 13th reflection, or shard, was tipped into the darkness's favor, albeit far too much, and this is said by the Ascian Emmet Selk in the game to have been a critical error.
So, we took it upon ourselves to rejoin the worlds. But in our eagerness and, I confess, our ignorance, we erred and made a useless Void of the 13th.
Thus, the Void was created and becomes what we are told by the game's lore to be a vacant place of ether and filled with monstrosities. Yet regarding the true nature of what occurred in the 13th to make it become the Void, and why darkness was so easily able to overtake it, we're left with very little to confirm a lot of parts of the why and how. Now, within the lore we're able to discover throughout the game, we can confirm some hard facts about the Flood of Darkness, as well as the Void itself. And I want to make it clear real quickly again that some facts in certain parts of the lore are openly left to interpret on our own. To begin with, let's go over what we do know as hard fact. The only reference we may have as to what actually occurred in the 13th is what occurred in the first reflection when the flood of light consumes the world. This flood of light, in comparison, is equivalent, just simply light aspected instead of dark aspected. We are given glimpses of what the world turned into, however, in the Alliance raid The World of Darkness at the end of the Crystal Tower raid series. From there we can see fragmented landscapes, we fight several creatures from the Void, and we know it's incredibly difficult to get back from the Void if we ever enter it. A small excerpt from the lore book states that the Flood of Darkness was partly due to the 13th Warriors of Light slaying primals, just like we do. But they also used an extra substance called auracite in order to help contain the primals they battled. But sadly it was imperfect as a weapon, and it allowed a bleeding of those primals' energy. One can only assume that the Ascians had a hand in this imperfection, and it's claimed that each time the warriors won, they changed, until only their insatiable appetite for ether was left, thus transforming them into some of the more powerful Voidsent, like Cuchulainn. This led to a war in the realm. This is reinforced by the exact story being told to us by Unukauhai from the Warring Triad questline. Following this, we are also given another piece of lore confirming Ascian involvement. So what we do know is that when the world was sundered, each world is attuned to a certain element more heavily than its counterparts. The 13th is stronger in darkness than in light, and this allowed the Ascian Igyorm to overwhelm the Warrior of Light mentioned in her lorebook entry, rather than the numerous ones in Cuchulainn's entry. What remains now is the Void as we currently know it, and as it stands, it's irreversibly damaged. Igyorm single-handedly became the driving force in current lore as to why the 13th fell to darkness. She may have only been brief in the main story and exposure, but she now has a huge impact in the story. She herself even says that the world will fall to chaos, that the gods will shake the firmament, because she did it once already. She saw the 13th fall. Even if it wasn't her intention, she still managed to do it. It's likely we are also going to discover more of her actions as we progress in the coming months, and probably into the next expansion. It shows how desperate the Ascians were in their earlier attempts to rejoin the worlds, as well as another version of the repercussions from tilting any of these shards in a particular direction. Now, the Void isn't a place one can just walk into or exit at their whim, and that means any inhabitant from either side, due to the fact that normally our world and the Void are separated by barriers. These barriers are a rift between the various reflections, and are meant to prevent them from interacting with one another. As of patch 6.1, we are given more intimate information about the two major ways one can cross the rift specifically to the Void, and vice versa. One is to find a weak point between the worlds called a planar fissure, while the other is created and called a void gate. If one were to enter the Void via a planar fissure or a void gate, they would find their aether drained and their mind and form twisted beyond recognition, just like the original people of that world. Thankfully, creating an opening to the other side is incredibly difficult, and even when it is accomplished, it takes a great deal of magic and ether, or luck. On top of that, more ether is required to stabilize these portals, and that alone can be costly to the summoner or whoever is creating this void gate. Yet this doesn't stop the various cults and others unsavory characters from purposefully looking to the Void for power, and to further their own agenda. So now we've delved into why the Void was even created, as well as what the realm itself entails, and what may happen if one were to cross the worlds. Regarding the nature of the Void, we know that anything essentially coming out of the other side is going to be twisted by the darkness. And since we know an entire world was consumed, there is inherently going to be just as many varying degrees of strength as there are individuals. With that in mind, we need to also discuss the creatures coming out of the Void, namely the Voidsent.
Mortals from the realm of light, you have not stumbled here without purpose. I am the cloud of darkness. What I do not smother, I devour. What I cannot devour, I destroy. mortals before the flood of darkness will sink lifeless into the void!
So what makes a Voidsent a Voidsent? Simply put, they are the remainder of the 13th's inhabitants who were horribly malformed in body and mind. With their world now consumed in primordial darkness, they seek to feed off ether abundant realms. On top of this, any other creature that enters the void and lingers there long enough will fall to the same fate. Anything that does so has its desires, need for ether, and basic primal instincts multiplied to uncontrollable levels, in most cases. Though, thanks to their abilities in nature, they easily asserted their place in our world as unseemly beings that must never be interacted with or allowed across that rift. However, there was no real way to classify them other than either experiencing their horrific powers and forms, which makes dealing with them rather difficult for the average person. Eorzea's scholars devised a hierarchy system to designate where the Voidsent may place itself among the ranks. In this system is referred to as the 12 rungs, with 1 being the pinnacle of both body and mind, and 12 being the weakest and most likely to serve another Voidsent or just not be very witty in general. Please be mindful though that there is no correlation to the 12 rungs and how the Voidsent may classify themselves, if they do at all, within the void. Even though the enemies themselves may not correlate their status to this system, it does allow us to get a sense of how strong an entity is. For the average adventurer or person, beings like imps and sprites that occupy the lowest rungs are typically not a major issue. But when stronger foes like demons or succubi are involved, places simply end up abandoned, rather than someone trying to fight these entities. We find examples of dark tales, abandoned keeps, and eerie halls fit for the hostile creatures who have long served as a scourge upon the world. Succubus occupy the 3rd and 4th rungs of the Voidsent hierarchy, and one of the more notable named ones is Halicarnassus from the dungeon Halkay Manor. Originally, Lady Amandine occupied this place as one of the nobles of Gridania. After the calamity, she was horribly scarred, and she killed her maidservants to perform blood sacrifices and blood rituals to summon this succubus. In exchange for her soul, she would get her beauty back, but ended up as a succubus herself. So that's just one example of the many Voidsent that occupy our world still, and or one that we may have had to defeat. However, there are much more powerful beings still around, and one of those beings is recognizable by longtime fans of the franchise. His name is Diabolos. He appears as a winged devil like Voidsent who is said to serve the Shadow Queen, Scathach, who was imprisoned on a Maki ship, the Void Ark. I couldn't find a whole lot of info about what rung he may occupy, but because of his power and what he does in the game, we can assume he resides in one of the top 3. Originally, he was summoned about 1600 years ago during the War of the Magi by the Void Mages of Mach. Their goal was to send him over to the White Mage city, Amdapor, to put an end to the conflict. However, this failed when he was sealed away, and we encountered Diabolos when we entered the lost city of those ancient White Mages, his slumber and seal having been disturbed by Bahamut's assault. Even though we managed to defeat him, he does manage to escape, despite the death scene at the very end of the dungeon. However, he does make an appearance again in the Void Ark series. There, he manages to absorb his former queen successfully to empower himself. This gives him enough strength to become Diabolos Hollow, and in the final confrontation, we just can't even damage him even as a 24-man raid for a very long time in the fight. This just proves how powerful these beings could be, and if we were not the Warrior of Light, the average person would be incredibly hard-pressed to defeat any of them. Now that's just an example of one of the higher-ranking Voidsent, but there are quite a few in the game that people simply don't remember or just walk by and they don't think twice when they go through the dungeons or raids. Another notable mention we're going to take a second to look at is the previously named Cuchulainn. From what lore I can find about him, he's actually pretty interesting as well. He's a multi-tentacled monster who has multiple chins and spits corrosive bile at the players. It's pretty gross, but his story is also pretty sad. Now, if we are to believe the lorebook's entry, he was actually one of the Void's champions. He's one of the original Warriors of Light from the 13th. Now, this is never truly confirmed, and take it with a grain of salt, but if it is true in any way, shape, or form, or if we're given any extra information on this particular being, it's a pretty horrific story. I personally couldn't imagine having to keep fighting and then see myself transform into this monster, and after all that time being sealed away in the Void Ark, only to reawaken and find the very kinds of people that I used to be fighting against me and trying to end my life. Stories like Cuchulainn's aren't exactly exclusive, minus the Warrior of Light bit. However, we do know that everyone in the Void pretty much got turned into some kind of creature, whether they wanted to or not. It's assumed that every single Voidsent is inherently evil, and while we do encounter pretty much all the actual evil ones, it's not always a fact. Some of them just want that balance that they've been stripped of, and in many cases, they are usually cooperative as long as we gift them some ether. In some instances, we find Voidsent being allowed to remain in our world in exchange for a service. Let's take the Gubal Library for example. The Bibliotaphs, or the final boss of the Gubal Library dungeon, is actually a massive tome that's been possessed by a Voidsent. In exchange for being in the realm of man, it must serve as the library's protector, and until the tome's ethereal core is depleted or until it's killed, the Voidsent will remain. The Bibliotaph is able to differentiate between friend and foe, although normally it tends to err on the side of foe, but for good reason. Among the ranks of the Voidsent are also bombs, gargoyles, voodoo-rigas, and demons, each with their own unique strengths, abilities, enhancements, and flaws. Between the constant flow of Voidsent entering our world, as well as the foreshadowing from Endwalker's story and Shadowbringers, it's safer to say that we're gonna have another otherworldly adventure, and it's obviously stated in the story as well. Though whether we save it or bar it from ever coming in contact with us again remains to be seen. Personally, I'd rather see it become a source of study than turn it back to what it used to be. And the reason for that is, unless we're gonna wait around for the entire world to be balanced again, like we saw what was happening in the Eden storyline, it doesn't make sense for us to wait around that long, nor do I think we'll be around that long to even see that to fruition. If anything, it can be a place of reference as to what could happen, and frankly, I don't think it's possible to fully erase what had occurred there, regardless. Yet the players can expect something exciting to happen with the way these devs are telling their stories. Currently though, it's assumed that we're unable to reverse anything that's currently occurring in the Void. We have no feasible way to safely traverse the world, we can't even get to it safely, and everything there wants to kill us, unlike the first. But don't mistake my cynicism for a potential missed opportunity. It's hinted at in several parts of the game that it is possible to save it, although in what way, we just have no idea yet. Plus, there's a lot of stuff they can do with the Void. We never killed the Cloud of Darkness. We don't know anything about the Warriors of Light, and for all we know, they could be rejoined with us. And, like I said, it's an entire world to contend with. So there's a lot more for us to deal with all at once compared to the first, back in Shadowbringers. So there's a lot of potential here, and it's really cool to see what they're going to do next, because even making this video, I had to really scrounge for some of the information. I couldn't find almost anything in certain parts of the lore or some of the cutscenes. Hopefully they make a wonderful new expansion, and I am really excited to see what the next few patches bring for this story. So thank you guys for joining me today and exploring what the Void is and what is in it. This took so long to make, and I appreciate any feedback you guys can give me so I can improve the next video for you guys. If I happen to miss anything, feel free to comment below, and any likes and subscribes greatly help me out and provide feedback as well. So thank you to anyone and everyone who helped me make this video, and I hope it's been fun for you guys too. We'll see everyone next time. So this is Temperance Brennan, and may you ever walk in the light of the crystal.